Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Let a few more people come in, and I'm going to record this. So if you want your picture on, or if you don't want your picture on, just so people who can't join us right now, they can watch it a little bit later. And this is, well, I'll introduce Gerald once everybody starts showing up. Give everybody another minute or two. Okay, well, we can get started and I'll allow them to come into the room. My name is Nicole Villanueva. I'm the education manager for the Eastern Sierra Interpretive Association. We're joined by Gerald Howard, who is a retired local educator, and he has kindly said he'd join us for the next hour or two to talk about Viola Martinez, the book, which he actually chose for us to read. So thank you so much, Gerald, for joining us and
my
giving us
pleasure.
some of your time. And as I said before, in case any of you missed, we're going to be recording this. So if you'd prefer not to have your video on, that's totally okay. But this is an open discussion, so feel free to unmute yourself and chime in whenever you'd like. I think maybe the best way to start is maybe asking Gerald kind of his connection to the book and maybe why he thought this would be a perfect read for us and any of his thoughts and insights as we dig in.
Okay. So do you want me to say why I selected the book? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've had this book for a while, and I never, like probably a lot of people that have a book and it just sits around, and all of a sudden one day you decide that you pick it up and start reading it. And my son Ryan had mentioned that the book club was looking for something that was local on Native American history. So I thought, well, this is a nice little book about a woman who accomplished many things and was local. And I was also connected to the book through Manzanar, because she talks about Manzanar, and we did a Zoom earlier this year about the book and about her working at Manzanar during that particular period. And so I just thought there were a lot of nice little things in the book that people could connect to on local history. And it caused me to kind of look and go through, documents and things of that sort that she mentioned. So just kind of retracing some things. But I thought it was kind of a good way of looking at the experiences of a local Native American person, especially a woman, and her boarding school experiences, which my father was at Sherman at the time that she was there. So we kind of have that connection as well. And I knew her sister Winona. So when they were looking for a good local book, I thought, well, this might be a good one for people to read, and it touches on all kinds of things in terms of the boarding school experience and achievement and racism and then growing up in a rural area and going to an urban area. So that's kind of that was one of the reasons. So I guess if anybody has any questions about the book, anything in particular, I might be able to answer. I'm more than willing to do so.
Well, how was your father's experience going to the Sherman Institute? Did he have the similar issue with that Viola found, where she lost kind of touch with her native language and there was kind of that disconnect, or was he able to still continue?
He was. It was one of those things where he never really talked about his experiences at Sherman, and so that's something that I need to explore. So as soon as the pandemic's over, hopefully soon, that I'll make my way to Sherman and find out more about my father and his experiences there. But he went there as a young boy, and he stayed until he graduated or until he left. So very much like Viola, he went there as a young man. He stayed, and he was, and like she said about the outing system, he had a lot of experiences. So he had experience in the trades, carpentry, masonry. He worked in the bakery, so he could bake. He did all kinds of things. And so, when we were growing up, he did all of the work around the house, the construction and the addition. And I do remember once when my parents liked to, take little vacations. So we went to Southern California when we were kids, but we did go to Sherman. I remember we were sitting on the front lawn under the palm trees, and we had lunch. But he never really talked specifically about his experiences there. But I'm sure, when we were kids, he would always go and visit older people, and maybe that was something that he missed, as a young person, having that cultural connection. And so we would always go to different places and see older people, and they would just visit and talk. And like most Native people, they still use their native language. We'd go to Independence, we'd go to Big Pine, he had an uncle over in Beatty, Nevada. So we go to Beatty, and there was, the Sunland Reservation. When I was a boy, there was one man that still lived out there, and so we would go by and we'd stop and visit with him. But yeah, he never really talked specifically about his experiences at Sherman. But he was there, and my mother went there too, and she has friends from there that she kept. So from my parents' generation, most people had an experience either at Sherman or at Stewart in Carson City. And so my aunts and uncles, they went to Stewart in Carson City. And my mother told me, she went to Stewart when she was a young girl with her sister. And the corporal punishment was tough, if you didn't obey things, or if you were speaking your language or things of that sort. She talked about that. But yeah, so that's, like I say, as time goes on, hopefully I can get down to Sherman and do some research. So
family research, yeah.
So, that's so they have that connection to Sherman. So and it still still operates, although I think it's closed right now. But it there are still students from the area, the local area, that opt to go to Sherman rather than to the local high schools. So yeah, so that's all I can say on that topic, unless somebody has a question.
Maybe you don't know this, but I thought it was interesting that she brought her aunt back to Bishop. Did her aunt learn English, or was she able to pick up some of her native language, or how were they able to communicate after that?
I'm sure that her aunt Mary Ann was, she was bilingual. She had her son living in Bridgeport, and she made her trips to Levining, and because most people during that particular period, they were, like she said, they were domestic servants, so they were always working for non-natives, and people were always looking for help. And it's kind of funny. My aunt, who she when she was a young girl, my maternal grandmother and great grandmother, they were all from Mono Lake, from Levining. So in the summer, my mother and her sisters, they would go to Levining and spend the summer with their grandmother. And my aunt, when she was in Levining one summer, there was a family that came up on a regular basis in the summer, and they would camp and do different things. But they got to know my aunt as a young girl, and so eventually they asked her to go to. They took her to Bakersfield. It's kind of like when she was talking about her sister, that kind of disappeared. The family took her, and they never brought her back. Mm-hmm. I thought about my aunt, and she went to Bakersfield, and she became kind of like a servant for them in Bakersfield. She did the cleaning and the washing and the cooking and things. And then she went to Bakersfield High School. And it was interesting because I talked to her. I said, you were going to high school at that time, and I know it was segregated. So how did that work? And she said, well, they had separate classes, and so all of the non-white students would always stay together in these groups, these classes. They could never integrate. But in some ways, her experiences in Bakersfield, I think she learned to play the piano, and she did different things, and in the end, she became a nurse. So it's like so many things. There's some downsides to things, but then there's some upswings to things too. And so a lot of times when I was looking at boarding school experiences for students, there are a lot of negative things connected to that, but yet at the same time, a lot of students were really coming from bad situations. So it was, in a way, it was kind of good for them. So it's just kind of a mixture of all kinds of good and bad things in the boarding schools. But, just being, in the more dominant society at that particular time, you were always subjected to discrimination and racism, and this is kind of how your life is. But some people, like Viola, they just kind of saw that as a challenge, and that's where I kind of think she's pretty gritty in that sense. Mm-hmm. She knew exactly what she wanted. And she wasn't going to be, dissuaded from things. And then she got support from people too, and that's always important. So So yeah, that's one of the things. I don't. That's kind of sad that they never did find their sister Alice.
Mm-hmm.
So somewhere out there, I guess Alice has a family.
Oh, Bernadette asked Mr. Howard, can you share how you think places like Manzanar can help tell the stories of shared removal between Indigenous families and Japanese Americans forced to live at Manzanar? I always begin my Manzanar presentation by saying that forced removal began in the 1860s and would like to know your perspective.
Well, it is. There are a lot of similarities in terms of being forced into an area that's not of your choosing, and then being subjected to um, kind of this second class person, or second class, or most of the native people um, in the 1860s, their life was just turned upside down, and then they were forced, in 1863 on this removal to Fort Tejon, and where they were incarcerated at Fort Tejon until it closed. But most of them were able to come home. But it's like Viola talked about in terms of coming home. It really wasn't your home. It was kind of like it was your home at one time, but now somebody else has it, and now now you have to ask permission to do certain things where it was your home at one time, and you didn't have to ask permission to do things, and that's tough. And that, I guess, rather than kind of giving up, you kind of make adjustments. And I think for when she talks about the part of Manzanar where she was working with Japanese American citizens there, that she saw that they were able, you just kind of adapt and you make certain changes that allow you to survive. And so I think that there are those things that people, when they're forced into situations like that, they can either give up, or or just decide that they're going to just continue on, but they'll make those necessary adjustments to adapt to their particular situation. And for Native people, that's kind of well, it is how they became, and then eventually, kind of being homeless, and then all of a sudden in the 1930s having these three reservations set up for them that are fairly small, and they're becoming crowded, but that's really that's all you have. So they're being forced into to a place like Manzanar, and giving up everything, and then in the end wanting to go home, but you can't go home because people don't want you there. That's tough, and so it's tough for it was tough for a lot of people. But that's one of the things, when I think about history, probably the lesson there is that you can kind of, you don't have to, you owe a lot to earlier generations for hanging on and doing the things that they did, that brought you here. And so that's kind of like, for me, sometimes I think, well, why should I feel so down when I'm not really facing the hardships that other people face, so it's really not as much as I can get through this kind of thing. And so that, so there are those parallels between Native people, and then Japanese Americans who were forced to live at Manzanar for that period, and then the downside to all of that. And so I don't know if I'm answering that question, but that just kind of going off. But yeah, it's tough for a lot of people, and there's still a lot of animosity, in the community, and sometimes when I hear like in the new political movement of people and, you know, anti-immigration and all of this stuff, I sit and I think now, where are you coming from here in terms of your discussion? I mean, you're not really from here. And I mean, for me, when I see that, I just kind of, that's the feeling I get. So anyway, that's I guess that's all I have to say on that. You know, what one of the things too, when I was looking at the book, and you know, she was never quite sure. Viola was never sure about her date of birth. You know, she knew that, you know, her mother died in 1918 from the influenza pandemic. So she figured she was born in 1917, because then there's another date, 1927, when she went to Sherman. But I served as tribal chairman on two different occasions in Bishop. One from 2004 to 2006, and then from 2014 to 2016. But in my first term, we had a historian, and his name was Joe Olinghouse, and he did work for us, and he had connections with the National Archives, and he'd bring up material, and we'd talk about different things. And so his expertise was like from 1900 forward. But I have documents that he gave me that, you know, that he found, and one of the things was a census from when they were looking for people. There were two types of Native people in the valley at the time. There were people that had allotments that they had applied for and that became their personal property. And then there were people that didn't have the allotments, and then they were considered homeless. And so there were groups of Native people living around Bishop in these kind of settlements, both to the north, east, and the west. And then Sunman Reservation had been established in 1912, but they did this census because they were trying to help these homeless, what they called homeless Indians. And so they did a census through the local Bureau of Indian Affairs agency. And in that, they talked about a group of people on the north side of Bishop. And in the census, they mentioned Viola's mother. They listed Viola's mother, Ivy, and then her daughters, all the way down to Viola. And then I thought, and then on the stamp, there's a stamp on the census form, the paper, and it says 1916. And it shows her as being 3 in 1916, which sometimes you're not quite sure about how the information is gathered, and is it accurate, and is it coming directly from people, or is it from people kind of just giving the information, but they don't know. But there's a lot of questions about the accuracy of dates in terms of documents connected to Native Americans. But I found that really interesting that all of a sudden they listed her family, and they listed Viola not as Moroni, but as Lent. And her older sisters were listed as Powers. And then there were Powers, Moroni, and then Viola and her sister Winona were listed as Lents. So I just thought that was really interesting. I don't know if she ever knew. I mean, I'm sure she'd never seen the document, but I don't know if that was accurate, because, saying 1916 and she was 3 years old, so she was born in there was a 4-year difference there. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty interesting. I just saw that and I thought, and then another thing that's kind of puzzling too is in terms of the book. She mentioned that when the when the reservations were established in the 1930s in Lone Pine, Big Pine, and Bishop, one of the things that they had to do in terms of the legislation, the 1937 legislation, was to go around and get consent from a majority of Native Americans in the valley. So they didn't want to have large meetings with natives about this land exchange. So what they decided to do, they would just kind of go around house to house and talk to people about it. And they'd have other Native people talk about it that were in support of this land exchange and the setting up of these 3 reservations. And so one of the requirements in the end was to have a list of people that approved of the land exchange. And that signified a majority. So I have a copy of the original hand signatures. So I thought, well, she talks about Tom Gusty, and Tom Gusty was a neighbor of mine. As when I was a child, he lived next door. And so I thought her sister, Winona, received an assignment. And I thought, well, Winona, you had to be 21 in 1937. So Winona and Viola would have been 21 in 1937. So I thought for sure I'd look through this list of signatures and I'd find them, but I never found their signatures. So then that's another thing puzzling to me, is like when they set up the reservations, and obviously the people that signed for the approved of the land exchange were the original ones that picked out where they wanted to live on these 3 assignments. On these 3 reservations. How they people that didn't sign it, were they included in that? And the feeling I got from other people is that no, those people weren't included. But I thought, well, if Winona and Viola didn't sign it, Viola never got an assignment, but her sister Winona did, and that's where they lived. So that's another kind of interesting thing that I'd like to research, is how the assignments were given out during that particular period, if you never really approved of the assignments. Somewhere in there, people got assignments that never signed up for the land exchange. But that was interesting. I was looking for their signatures, but I couldn't find it. So that's there are just a lot of little things about her life. But she was pretty, I guess, tenacious, and wanting to go on. She was a very curious person from her book, and she went on to do some good things. And she wanted to be a teacher here in Bishop, but that wasn't allowed. So it's, she didn't start her teaching career until just later on. So I have a question. Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, Gerald. When do you think the first Native American teacher could teach in Bishop?
Well, I don't. When I came, things kind of got, Bishop was the first place of an Indian education center, and that was started, I want to say, in 1969, and so in the late 60s there was this kind of, with all of the the changes in terms of civil rights, and Indian education became important. And so like in the 60s, there was this push to, and I was thinking about this because in the public schools at the time, and probably just about everywhere, you had a track system. So you had college prep and non-college prep. And so just about probably 99% of Native people were always pushed into this non-college bound, because the priority was just to graduate from high school. And so if you were exceptional in some way. Maybe you got into these college prep courses and you could go on. But I'm thinking that probably about 1970s, the mid 1970s, there was a teacher that came here. His name, I forget his name, but he taught in Bishop maybe from 76 to 78. And then he left. So I think he was just here for 2 years, but he wasn't from here, but he taught. And then after that, they hired a couple of local people. They didn't have credentials, but they were able to do like these, they had like I can't remember if it was Title VII, a program where you could mentor Native students in the high school. And so they had a couple of people do that until 1979. But it was interesting. I came home one summer and I was at Manor Market. And while I was coming out, I ran into Don Taylor, who was the superintendent of the high school. And he had been the superintendent when I was there. And he stopped me and he goes, Gerald, I hear you just graduated. You think you'd be interested in a teaching position at Bishop High School? I have an opening. And I said, well, I would be interested in that. I said, but I was just accepted into a credentialing program. So once I'm done with that, maybe we could talk. And he said, sure. He said, well, you come back next year and we'll talk about that. So I did. So in 79, I started and I stayed there for 34 years. So, but those are the only teachers that I know of. So it was probably like 76 that you had the first Native teacher come and teach in the school system, at least in Bishop. And I don't think there was anything in Big Pine or Lone Pine. So it's fairly recent. And now I think we have a couple of local Native people that are teachers at the elementary level. So I'd like to see more, but yeah, that's about the time frame. So yeah, and
I also, this is Gail Gerald. I was very much struck in the book by the sense of family and extended family, and that there wasn't a whole lot of, concentration on whether that you knew specifically who the father was, or, that it was just a sense of taking care of each other. And I was wondering, do you still see that? Has that continued? And I hear some of it in how people are called auntie or uncle or brother. But do you feel like that sense of taking care of each other is still strong in the Native community?
It is, and it's and you don't. I guess like most things in society, I guess when you have a hard time, or maybe there's a death, all of a sudden you just find all of this help from different people, and it's really extended family, and it's such a good feeling that all of these people come out and they give you this support and they just help you. And then I guess that, so it still exists. And sometimes, when I was teaching, when I'd read an obituary in the local paper in the Union Register, and I would, see a person and it said, well, they were raised in New York, and then they settled in Chicago, and then eventually they ended up in Bishop, and then they passed away in Bishop. And I remember one time just thinking about that, and I thought it seems so, to me, I kind of felt kind of sad by that, because I thought that, they don't really have that real strong connection. Maybe maybe through their local church or some association, they have that. But as far as like having this extended family always there, I thought, in a way, I thought I kind of felt blessed by that. I thought, I have, I live with, with my immediate, well, with my sisters, they're nearby, and my brothers, and I've got cousins, and and I've got family up through Levining and Bridgeport and down into, the Big Pine. And so it's, people still just have those connections, and you don't, sometimes you really don't know. Like I ran into actually an Irvin Lent, and he lives in Bridgeport. But I remember this was just last summer, and I ran into him, and he called me cousin, and I thought, well, I guess yes, we probably are kind of in some distant way, we're cousins, but yeah, you just have this connection with all these people, and it's really a good feeling. And from reading her book, I was thinking about her older sister, and who I knew, Edith, and her other sister Leora, when I was young, and then I grew up with their grandkids, and at the time I never knew that they were all related, and until I was thinking about reading the book, and I was thinking, oh gosh, they were all these people that were my age, they were all connected, but they never really talked about, well, that's, at least I never heard it like, she's my cousin, he's my cousin, and but yeah, you have all of these connections, and they still exist. They're still pretty strong. So, and it's, whenever somebody's in, it's like your uncle said, we don't need, insurance because we have our, our extended family that take care of us, and people still think that. They still feel that way, and you can, in hard times, you can see it. People just come out and they do really good things for you. So yeah, so it's still pretty strong. And it's kind of it's one of those things too, where my aunt just passed away. So later on today, I'll be going to kind of a service in Big Pine, but it's just for family members. But I'm sure I'll see a lot of family members there. So, and I had been visiting with my uncle because he's 95. And he was the youngest of my father's family, and so I would go down. When I was doing this thing for Manzanar, I just wanted to talk to him about that particular period. But he was at Stewart Indian School at the time. But I would go down and talk to Lee and Betty, and we just sit and talk about the stories when they were kids, and then I was trying to find out more about my father's side of the family. And kind of one of the sad things was that, when they were young, my grandfather passed away at an early age. And he said, once that happened, the family just fell apart. And then he went off to Stewart and spent 7 years there. And so he kind of missed out on a lot of information during that particular time. And then when he was 17, my grandmother allowed him to go into the Navy. So he went off and served in the Pacific during World War II. And it's just one of those things, but the family's all there. It's just, family's really important. And they call it your himu. Himu is your immediate family. And then your iniwa is your extended family. So it's, so, people are just connected in different ways, and to different, some people are connected to, like Death Valley and Shoshone, and people are connected to the western side of the Sierras, or up into Yarrington and Smith Valley. So it's just a really extended network of families. And what's kind of interesting thinking about family And like she mentions in her book too, my my great grandmothers, and they were exceptional basket weavers. And some of their baskets are over in the museum in Yosemite. But they ended up with the same husband or same man. And so when they were older, they came down to Bishop, and eventually they lived with my aunt. But my aunt had a little house. It kind of reminds me of the little house that Viola mentions for Mary Ann. But they had a little house, but it was divided. And at one end there was so it was divided, and there was a door at each end. And so my grandmothers lived in that little house. They each had their separate rooms and their separate doors. And my mom would say, well, they were they got along, but they didn't really get along because they shared the same man. But I just remember going there, and as I'd always have to, when we come up and my mom would take me to visit, I was always so, I guess like any little kid, because they always seemed so old, and it just kind of terrified me in a way. But I just remember going, we'd have to go and visit them. so yeah, but that's another little connection. I think, traditionally that kind of happened a lot, and maybe if something happened to, a sister's husband, then the sister went to live with maybe her sister, and I don't know, but I think that was something maybe in traditional lifestyle of that particular period. So yeah, and I don't know, I just kind of went off rambling, so I don't know if I answered anything. But yeah.
So I have another comment, Gerald.
Okay.
As I was trying to, because I got confused with the family relations, and all the extended family, but then I started to realize, I was trying to interpret it from a different culture, and it's just like I'm trying to fuse it into what I'm more familiar with, and it's not the way the Native Americans interpreted, relationships.
Yeah. No, it is, and it's and especially trying to follow names, like with all of the different surnames, from like she had a picture of her uncles, but they all had different names, and and one of the things that I when I was teaching at a point, I thought, we would be good to go out and have students do these local interviews. So we sat down and we made like a question sheet for students to do these interviews. And so students would go out and they would do these interviews. They'd pick out usually it was like with a grandparent, or maybe it was a neighbor or someone. But through this interview system, a girl was out in Round Valley, and she interviewed a couple of sisters out there. They weren't Native, but I got the impression they were probably in their 90s at the time. But anyway, she got to talking to them, and then she came back and she shared her interview with us, with the class, and she said, these ladies were telling her that back in those days where Native people were, that local ranchers and farmers needed their help, and so they would take in families and they'd work on their ranches and farms. And she said, they said that if you were really good to your help, if you were really good to them, they took your last name. And she said, and then if you weren't good to them, then nobody took your name. And so it came, when I started thinking about that, I was thinking, oh yeah, so there's like Kinneys and Barlows and Shaws, and I mean there are all these names that were local ranchers. Um, but I can see, you know, sometimes, you know, when people, you know, well, I can't pronounce your name, so I'm going to give you this name, or you take this name. And so things just kind of they just got scattered, you know, with all these different names and how they're connected. And, but yeah, it's pretty confusing when you think about all of this. And years ago, my mother did a family tree from her family in Mona Lake, and my grandmother had all of these my great grandma had all of these children, and so she listed all of these things so I would know exactly how they were connected. And so I know I still have it someplace, but I've got to find it so I can see how the family, because it's a fairly large family from the Mona Lake area. So, but yeah, it's all of these different names that come up and how people got their names. And yeah, it is, when you try and think about it and just these direct connections, or like my little cousins, you know, they'll call me uncle, you know, but I'm not technically really their uncle, like in the way you would see it nowadays, but that's how they refer to me, as their uncle. So yeah, it is. It's really it's a really confusing system in a way, but it's a system that you, like I say, it's just kind of really a strong bond. Whenever you need help, you can get it, you know. So yeah, and having the family like that is, when we would, for my kids, you know, whenever I needed a babysitter, it was very easy to find a babysitter, somebody to take care of your kids for a day or for a few hours. It's pretty easy. So yeah, I don't know if I answered that for you, but it's a very large connected family. So yeah, and Viola, she, you know, she's, what's kind of striking for me is that and I'm sure she's buried in Los Angeles, but for all those years, she spent, you know, more time in Los Angeles, in that area, than, you know, I mean, she was forced to move. She didn't really want to do that, but that was just the way things were at the time. But yeah, she really, really did get disconnected to things. And, you know, she was trying to find her way home in a way. But she was pretty remarkable. So yeah, I'm just kind of, you know, when I think about, you know, coming back to, you know, being away for so long and then losing family, and, you know, not knowing who's who now, and it was funny. And a lot of the people that she has photos in there, I knew also. So it's just kind of funny that I never really just got to meet her and talk to her about maybe teaching, you know, and you know, how things have changed since her time. So anyway, does anybody else have any other questions? Or hopefully I answered those questions for you. But
I do, Gerald.
yeah.
Are you willing to share your thoughts about reparation? I was thinking of it when you were talking about how the reservations are getting more and more crowded. And I've seen lately Black Americans and Japanese Americans working together for reparations, but it seemed like they left out Indigenous people.
Well, you know, it's kind of in a way we've received some reparations. There was I wouldn't say it, well, it's never going to be fair, but there have been these settlements with with Native people, especially in California. And I think the last one was in maybe 1980 or 81. There was a settlement for California Indians, but the settlement was based on land values in 1855 or something like that. So it came down to like $1 an acre or something like that. But some people, I accepted the payment at that time, and there were other Native people, older people, that never did. They wouldn't accept that payment for the land. So there are some people that are, and I know that they passed on, but I don't know how that ever settled. But yeah, there's been settlements like that, and I think that's a good thing, because there's so much that's been lost, and not because people were just neglectful, but that they were treated unfairly. And so, I mentioned earlier to Nicole, I started watching that Finding Your Roots program on PBS. And the one thing, that was sad for a lot of people was that, for African Americans, they can only trace so far. I mean, and then it's gone, and it's all because of slavery. And so, yeah, there should be some compensation for the loss of that information, where other people can go and they can trace it back and find different things. But for so many African Americans, you just can't do that. It's just gone. I mean, so, it's not going to, it's just a way of recognizing that something went wrong, and here's a small, adjustment for that. I think it's fair. I think it's more than fair to have something like that done. So, yeah, one of the things too, I think, in terms of, like Viola, she talks about her, well, I guess sometimes you think about how education, like she talks about being in the margin as being kind of, people say, well, maybe that's kind of negative, but I think being in the margin gives you these advantages, these opportunities, and makes you see things in a little different way, and gives you a better understanding of things. And maybe she kind of fell maybe more to one side than the other, but she still really tried to hang on to that part of her life that connected her to the Owens Valley. But I think being in that margin gives you so many things, and I think sometimes like when you're separated from something, it creates more of an interest and a desire to learn more about things. And I think she was that way. It was like, I was taken from this place, but I'd like to learn more about it. And so she had this stronger connection to this particular point in her life where she just wanted to know more about. And I can understand that. I think sometimes when you kind of caught in these two worlds, and I've thought about that too in my own personal life. And I thought, here I am, a Native person. I'm teaching U.S. history, and I'm teaching kind of Anglo history and stuff. It made me feel kind of strange, but I just kind of say, well, that's my job. That's what I'm hired to do, and that's what I'm going to do. And at an earlier point in my career, when I was first hired, I was hired as a kind of an opportunity teacher, but then since I had a credential, I could also teach in the social studies. So the school was good about it in those days, and there wasn't this standardized curriculum so for the state. So they gave me the opportunity. I could teach Native American history. I could teach Native American literature. I could teach these other little classes that were more connected. And that was really good. It was good for me. And I think it was good for the students because all of a sudden they could see a part of history that they weren't going to be exposed to, you know, in terms of just your traditional US history class. And we had a nice program because, and it was also accepted by the state's college system. They would accept it as US history credit. So, you know, I had those classes, and what was really interesting, you know, it was about a 50-50 split. I'd have, you know, 50% Native students and 50% non-Native students. And it was, you know, it was really a good thing. And I enjoyed that. And, but then once the state came through with their mandated standardized curriculum, all of that stuff had to be put aside, and you couldn't really go in that direction anymore. And I also felt that way too when I was teaching with Hispanic students. There was a part of history we could kind of touch upon a little bit, but you couldn't really go into that because it wasn't part of the curriculum. But I thought they need to know that too. You know, knowing your past is just going to make you a stronger person. But that's the downside of having this standardized curriculum in terms of your U.S. history or your world history now, is that you don't really have that flexibility of kind of going off and exploring these other things. So, but I think, sometimes, at least for me, in terms of kind of being in that kind of that margin, it was kind of a strength, because I always felt that I could kind of go into both areas. And some people couldn't, but I've always felt that it was an advantage to me. I could do these different things. So yeah. So I kind of see that the margin it's really kind of a positive thing. It's not necessarily a negative thing. And being in that position, it's given me so many opportunities to do different things and give me a whole different perspective on things. It's just good. So anyway, that was my little spiel.
Bernadette has a follow-up question.
Okay.
She said, one of the things that she's heard from Japanese Americans is that the apology was more important than the money. Do you feel that the U.S. government should do that for Native people?
Oh, I think so. I think, just that recognition of saying, that, things were done wrong, and the things that happened to you were wrong. And when I think about just the local history of the Valley, sometimes I think of other places, where tribes have kind of been able to keep cultural things more intact. Like if you were on the Navajo reservation, or if you were out in the plains, or there was some place where where this advancing settlement, encroachment forced, you could escape to someplace else. You could go off and kind of be away from that. Here in the Owens Valley, there was really no place to go. It's just a narrow little valley, and you're kind of, you're here. You can't go anywhere. And so you were subjected to all of this forced change in a very short period of time. And so sometimes when I think back about that particular period, when I had the opportunity to go to Chicago one summer and go to the Newberry Library. It's a research library in Chicago, and spend the summer with other Native teachers and just take courses, but also do some research. And I was looking through and some files, and I thought, oh, here's a little report from the Centennial in 1876. where the Smithsonian sent out people across the country to find information on Native Americans that they could share in terms of the centennial. And there were people that came to the Owens Valley, and their little report was saying, we came, but we didn't find very much. And I thought, wow, that's kind of odd. But then I thought there are two things going on here. There's one where Native people aren't going to be so willing to share things with you. And then the second thing that, there was all of this change from about 1862 in a matter of, say 14 years, your world was kind of turned upside down, and people that probably had, a lot of cultural information, older people, they probably didn't survive that period. And so, being in this oral tradition, you probably lost a lot of good information in a very short period of time. And so I think, that's such a travesty. All of the things that if that didn't happen, or if it was more gradual or something, you could have retained so much more. But, things, it was just an upheaval. And then from that point on, things didn't get any better, and people were sent to boarding schools, and, people just kind of lived on the fringes of society. So I do feel that it's just, it would be nice to, it's good when somebody says that they've, they apologize for doing such bad things, to other people. And so, I think that is important when they, the government comes out and says, yeah, we did some very bad things. We apologize for that. And I know things aren't the best, but, maybe we can do other things. And sometimes when I was chairman, we were, thinking, how can we, because the reservation here in Bishop is only 1.5 square miles. So, I would like to see the reservation grow a little more. And we've thought about, sitting down with this LA, DWP, and trying to acquire more leased land around the reservation. And that's, I think that's still alive. It's just, you just, people have to be willing to really commit to that and try and work something out. But yeah. I forgot her question now. What was she saying?
She was asking, would the apology be more important than the money?
Oh yeah,
The US
the
government?
apology would be more important, I think, for a lot of people. And like I say, people still, they still feel pretty, I guess, angry about that. Even though it's been such a long time, but people still feel hurt by that. So yeah, that would be good. Let's see.
Yeah, well, it's 10 and we don't want to take up too much of your time, Gerald. We really, really appreciate you joining us and sharing your stories and connecting them to Viola. And thank you for choosing this book. It was really great. Yeah, Bernadette says thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Yep. And one little plug. I don't know if you all noticed, Viola mentioned seeing Ansel Adams taking pictures
Right.
around Manzanar for Born Free and Equal. And Isia has joined with City Files Press Publishing, Manzanar Historical Site, and Ansel Adams Publishing Rights Trust, and Alan and Julie Ross. Alan was an apprentice of Ansel. And we are reprinting 3,000 copies of Born Free and Equal.
Oh,
And that
nice.
will be our April book club. Jeff is working on seeing if maybe we can get somebody from Ansel Adams group to come in and speak with us about that. And yeah, it's it's a nice little connection that we found between the two.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. So, hey, one last thing I'll share with you. Now, it was kind of a thing with the, when I was doing student interviews, having the students go out and interview. I had a student come back. She had interviewed her grandmother who had worked at Manzanar. And it's connected to the book. But through the interview, and she was Native. And she said she worked there, but she goes, I remember, my grandmother said she remembers a time when there was a Native guy who went into the camp because Native people were working there. And then it was time to go and they were leaving and they stopped him because they thought that he was a Japanese person trying to escape. And so they stopped him and they wouldn't let him out. And I thought, well, then her grandmother mentioned Tom Gusty. And I thought, oh, wow. So when I was down at Manzanar years ago, I mentioned it to them and they said, we'd heard about a story like that. But in Viola's book, she mentions Tom Gusty being stopped and he not being able to get out until she helped him get out. But I thought that was pretty interesting. So anyway, well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Gerald. And yes, everybody, thank you all for joining us. And thank you again, Gerald. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.